Hit it, BD. Now he comes to us. He's coming a little high. Oh, really high! Hold on!
Hello there.
Today we'll be reviewing Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which I've been streaming on the channel over the last couple of days. This title was provided to me by EA under the Creator Network so that I could give it a look and tell you my opinions on it. Now I realize I'm well outside the review embargo, but I only got my code on release day and I wanted to play enough of the game before giving my opinion, so hopefully this is still helpful. As per usual, if you end up enjoying this review, I'd really appreciate it if you could consider taking the time to like and share the video, as that would be very helpful for a review that couldn't hit the embargo window for reasons outside of my control. Jedi Survivor is an action-adventure game with a mix of open-world and Metroidvania elements. Now, to give some context, I personally really enjoyed its predecessor, Jedi Fallen Order, which I felt treated the Star Wars universe with more respect than Disney has in recent years. Jedi Fallen Order had a good story, engaging combat, and was overall a pretty good experience. Jedi Survivor builds and expands on its predecessor, but it doesn't really revolutionize the IP. As is the case with many AAA games these days, Jedi Survivor was released in a brutally undercooked state.
What is that there? What is that there? What is that?
This is...
Yeah, it's fucking raw!
Which naturally means that people will mostly just remember this game for its poor performance rather than its merits. I believe this was due to a rushed development cycle, since the game's director Stig Asmussen was bragging about how it only took them roughly 3 years to put the game together. Well, guess what? It shows. It's about as well put together as the Millennium Falcon in Empire Strikes Back. You know, the one where they spent the whole movie trying to fix the hyperdrive.
Punch it!
I feel like that's the perfect metaphor for this game because that's what this team is going to be doing for the next couple of months. Fixing the hyperdrive, or in this case, the game's performance. And you want to know the worst part? The worst part is that this game is actually quite good. Despite not being perfect, and there's definitely some room for criticism. I think that for a lot of people, it might have even been among some of the best releases of 2023 if it weren't for the performance problems. Now, when choosing which platform I was going to be playing the game on, I opted for the PlayStation 5, so my experience was not nearly as bad as what I've seen online for people who opted to play the game on PC. However, the narrative I saw on social media, where some people were clamoring that the game runs fine on PS5, is quite simply not true. There are several instances where performance mode downgrades the visuals in a brutal fashion and is still unable to maintain a stable frame rate, which is completely unacceptable, as in these cases you can't really hide behind the excuse of hardware diversity. Having said that, I would be lying if I was to say I didn't enjoy the game. I liked Star Wars Jedi Survivor because I like Star Wars. And as a 40-year-old jaded Star Wars fan, there's actually not that many opportunities to enjoy what was once the greatest sci-fi intellectual property of all time. If you strip away the performance issues, there's a really good game in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, doubly so if you're a Star Wars fan. But unfortunately, that's not really what people will remember from this game's launch. What they will remember, however, is how poorly it ran. I believe one of the main reasons for the game releasing when it did was because EA didn't want to go near the release dates of Tears of the Kingdom, Diablo 4, and Final Fantasy 16, so they would either release now or push back all the way to July. I think EA should have had more faith in Respawn and allowed them to polish up their game, even if it meant going up against these other giants, because at least then it could have stood on its own merits as a game, instead of simply trying to get a good release window. But you know, gaming nowadays is mostly about financials, so I also assumed that was a big decision, and unfortunately, most consumers have very little self-control, so in the short term, this move will likely be a profitable one. But in the long term, the damage to Respawn Star Wars Games brand is going to be felt. From a fidelity standpoint, Star Wars Jedi Survivor is gorgeous when in quality mode. The art style is very immersive and really brings the Star Wars universe to life, making you feel like you're in a Star Wars movie. Animations are very good, lightsaber swings, blaster shots, finishing moves, wall running, jumping, it all looks really good. My biggest complaint, however, is the motion blur. Even when the setting is completely turned off, there are several animations that apply a motion blur effect when Cal is performing certain actions, and I don't understand why. This is not immersive, this does not look good in any conceivable way as far as I'm concerned, and it shouldn't be a thing the moment that I turn off motion blur. Cutscenes are outstanding, but they are limited to 30 FPS. I'm assuming this is also the case for PC, as I only played on PlayStation 5. And I'm getting pretty tired of this, to be honest. Cutscenes should be in 60 FPS if the game is running on performance mode, end of. And I understand that most games do this nowadays. They go from 60 FPS gameplay to a 30 FPS cutscene with all the subtlety of an AT-AT trying to sneak up on a rebel base. The fact that most games do this is not an excuse. It just means they're all wrong. If I'm playing at 60 FPS and you hit me with what is meant to be a seamless transition into a 30 FPS cutscene, it is jarring and instantly breaks immersion. And I don't want to hear any of this cinematic nonsense. Either stick to 30 FPS for the whole thing or 60 FPS for the whole thing. And while we're on the subject of frame rate, let's address the rancor in the room: performance. In quality mode, the game looks stunning, but struggles to maintain 30 FPS, and depending on what is happening on screen, I suspect it's actually dropping into the high teens. In performance mode, it looks decent, but it has an extremely aggressive dynamic resolution that kicks in as soon as frames start dropping. But the strange thing is that the lower resolution doesn't really seem to improve the performance that much, which caused me to actually swap to quality mode when performance mode couldn't keep up the frames, because if I'm playing at 30 FPS, I might as well keep the resolution. Not to mention that when your frame rate is jumping between 25 and 50, you might as well settle for lower frames with less variation, because that variation is the more egregious part. It's also worth noting that unlike what I've seen on social media, these issues are not exclusive to the PC port. The PlayStation 5 version also suffers from performance issues, and I'd wager the Xbox Series X isn't faring much better. The following footage was recorded after the second patch, which supposedly addresses some performance issues, but as you can see, we're dipping well below 30 FPS while in performance mode, and our resolution is dropping lower than the Jedi Council stocks after Episode 3. During this recording, the game wasn't even registering inputs properly. Now, is this happening all the time? No, but there are several sections in the game that do have what I would consider unacceptable performance drops. And while it didn't stop me from still enjoying the game, it was definitely frustrating, and it would have been a lot worse if I was playing on a higher difficulty with tighter parry windows. Another issue is with loading assets. When going in and out of the saloon, which is a very important hub with lots of vendors and other activities, you have to wait at a door for the assets to load. Once this door opens, the interior textures haven't actually loaded in properly, giving you a few seconds of Nintendo 64 era visuals before things return to normal. It's hard to believe the game was shipped in this state. It's doubly painful as I can feel the passion this team has for the Star Wars IP, which has been handled by Disney with about as much care as the Village Speeder. Everyone gets a turn and everyone returns the damn thing more mangled than before. The speeder doesn't even hover anymore, it just gets dragged around by banthas with an unrelenting bowel disorder. And speaking on bowel disorders, someone said in a Steam review the game runs like my ass after Taco Bell. But I believe that's a very unfair thing to say, as that would indicate the game would actually be running at a very high frame rate, which is clearly not the case.
Identify yourself. Oh, it's you. You will regret that.
Beautiful camera work.
Nice work, everyone. Can't shake him. Hold on.
That's the way to do it.
That's one way to do it.
When it comes to sound, well, it's Star Wars, and for some reason EA never seems to miss with sound when it comes to Star Wars. The lightsaber humming and clashing is perfect, the blaster shots and explosions are spot on, and the soundtrack is on point. It even has some original tracks that I didn't get to properly experience on stream due to copyright concerns, but they sounded really good. The voice acting is stellar, as is the performance on display, as I mentioned earlier with the spectacular cutscenes. And I particularly enjoyed the game leaning into funny droid banter, where they're constantly making amusing remarks, both outside of and during combat. When it comes to story, I won't go into spoiler territory, so I'll just use some vague references. The previous game, Jedi Fallen Order, tells the story of a ragtag team of adventurers who took on the Empire and fought for a cause they believed in. It added a quality adventure that takes place between episodes 3 and 4 and makes sense within the canon lore of Star Wars. Perhaps more importantly, it respects the source material and adds value to it, which is more than I can say for the sequel trilogy. In case you're wondering, I would definitely recommend playing Fallen Order before playing Jedi Survivor, as that will give you more context to the events and characters present in the game. Jedi Survivor has a few flashback scenes that provide some background of the previous game, but I still think it's insufficient if you truly want to immerse yourself in this series. Not to mention, if you haven't played Fallen Order, you can probably get it on discount, start your Cal Kestis journey, and then pick up Jedi Survivor when the performance is in a better state, and possibly at a discount. Jedi Survivor takes place 5 years after the events of Fallen Order, and things are a little different. Cal Kestis has been fighting the Empire with a different set of characters, and it's not immediately explained why he's no longer with his old crew. Although this is revealed throughout the game in flashback sequences, which serve the purpose of both informing new players and reminding returning players of some of the events from the previous game. These sequences will also fill in some of the blanks for events that led to the disbanding of the original crew. As you progress through the story, Cal will reunite with some of his old crewmates as they once again find a common goal to strive for. Cal and his team will battle the Empire as well as a new faction of enemies as they struggle to bring hope to a galaxy swarming with Imperial forces. As you can imagine, with a story focused around the Jedi, there will be some conflict between the light and dark side of the Force. And if there's one thing I would have liked to see, is a little more player agency in that aspect. I'm not saying I want a full-fledged alternate ending, even though that would have been really nice, but at least some acknowledgement of the way in which you use the Force throughout the campaign. But unfortunately, everything story-wise is pretty linear regardless of how reckless you are with your use of the Force. Suffice to say, the story is pretty good. It's not perfect, and there were several story beats that I saw coming a mile away, but it was still very much an enjoyable experience as someone who likes Star Wars with some very enjoyable set pieces. Now, I have to give Jedi Survivor some props for how they dealt with character customization. Naturally, this is a narrative-driven adventure where you'll play as Cal Kestis. However, you still get some degree of freedom as to how he looks. You can change his hairstyle, facial hair, and 3 items of clothing: jacket, shirt, and pants. Beyond that, you can also change your lightsaber hilt, and you'll be surprised with the level of customization this allows, changing each individual part of the hilt, the materials, the colors, etc. You're also going to be able to change the look of BD-1, which is Cal's droid, and your blaster when you eventually get it. Initially, your selection of cosmetics is rather limited, but rather than take the easy way out and sell you additional cosmetics for real money, you actually unlock them by playing the game. Sometimes you find them hidden out in the world, or you're going to be using different in-game currencies which you can only collect by playing the game to purchase new cosmetics.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
The keywords for gameplay in Jedi Survivor is good and fun, but still shy of truly amazing. I guess I'll start with combat, as that's one aspect I tend to focus on the most when playing video games. In Jedi Survivor, as you play through the game, you'll unlock several different stances you can switch between, which makes Cal Kestis' lightsaber a very versatile one. You can freely swap between single blade, twin blade, which is Darth Maul style, dual blade, which is essentially wielding dual sabers, and cross guard, which is Kylo Ren's saber style, and it basically works like wielding a greatsword, with slower, more damaging attacks. Throughout the story, you'll also eventually unlock a blaster stance, which consists of wielding a single blade saber on your right hand and a blaster on the left. This was my favorite stance, since it was as close as I was going to get to Han Solo style. While the stances don't drastically change the way you play the game, they each provide you with a slightly different flavor of combat, which is nice. As you can imagine, lightsaber swinging is your bread and butter with two different attacks, a light attack and a heavy attack that uses what I've come to refer to as force juice. In the case of blaster stance, the heavy attack is basically using your blaster. Each of the stances has its own skill tree, which changes the way some of these attacks work and provides you with very special attacks specific to each stance. A couple of examples would be single saber getting a gap closer attack, cross guard gets a special parry that empowers the projectiles to reflect, and blaster stance gets a multi-shot lock-on as well as a whole lot more. So far, we've been talking about offensive options. Now let's talk a little about defense. Lightsabers can also block and parry, with parry essentially being a last-second block. In my opinion, this is a better option than a separate button, as it allows you to more easily tackle multiple enemies while still being able to risk parries. And then there's dodge. Naturally, not all attacks can be parried, and sometimes enemies will glow red, indicating that you need to dodge the next attack. These attacks will have wildly different timings, forcing you to react differently depending on the enemy you are fighting. All of this is fine, however, dodging is where I feel combat shows its biggest weakness. You can single tap for a short side hop or double tap for a longer dodge. The longer dodge has a much bigger recovery window, leaving you open, which is reasonable. What is not reasonable, however, is the ungodly tracking certain enemies have with their one-shot attacks. Most humanoid enemies feel reasonably fair, as dodging works like you would expect. However, larger creatures have what I can only describe as an incredibly generous hitbox for their unblockable attacks, which means you can be midway into your dodge animation on a different zip code and they'll still get you. This never feels good or even fair, especially with one-shot attacks. This specific aspect of the dodge is the biggest thing that kept me from fully embracing the combat. There were fights where I dodged the same attack at the same exact time, in the same exact direction, in the same exact way, and sometimes I would get hit, sometimes I wouldn't. It felt very much random, maybe even tied to the performance of the game in some way. I don't know, but it was very inconsistent from my personal experience. Beyond your bread and butter melee combo of slash, dodge, and parry, you also have a few force powers like push and pull, lift and slam, as well as a mass slow that functions as your ultimates. As I said at the start of this segment, overall the combat is good and fun, but just shy of amazing. Traversal feels pretty good throughout the levels and open areas, some of which even include mounts. Exploration is rewarding, even if the side quests known as rumors are somewhat lacking in terms of story implications or just additional context for the events taking place in the game. I stopped doing side quests early on and focused on the main story to unlock the Metroidvania power-ups that granted me access to more areas so I could explore further whenever I decided to go back to doing side quests. But after finishing the game, I didn't really feel like going back for these side quests, as there really wasn't much there, besides a few power upgrades that aren't really mandatory. Now, I did force myself to do the Bounty Hunter subquests as I became aware of something during the credits roll, but those quests basically consisted of system hopping back and forth from Kobo, just killing random enemies for an eventual cutscene that was basically a little bit of fan service. I feel like the game truly shines in the main campaign, and the rest is mostly window dressing with very little impact on your experience. For reference, I played the whole game on Jedi Master difficulty, which is the 4th difficulty out of the 5 available. In my personal opinion, 5 difficulties are way too much for this team to balance properly, which leads to an overall inferior experience due to inconsistent weird spikes in difficulty. This makes absolutely no sense in any conceivable way, and this is what happens in 90% of games that feature more than 3 difficulty settings. They are poorly balanced. I mean, this team couldn't even ship a game that would run at a stable 60 FPS on a 4090. Did we really expect them to tailor an experience across 5 different difficulty settings? Quality over quantity, people. Less is more. Except when it comes to frame rate. You always want more frames. Always. Now look, I really enjoyed playing Star Wars Jedi Survivor. While the combat is not perfect, it's still very much enjoyable. It's a very immersive experience, the campaign is fun, I like the story, it even rekindled some of the joy of the Star Wars fan in me. But unfortunately, I cannot recommend Star Wars Jedi Survivor in its current state. Even after the second patch, the game still experiences significant performance issues in some sections on PlayStation 5, and I can't even imagine what the PC experience is looking like. It is truly saddening because it's evident that the team behind this game has a deep passion for the Star Wars franchise, and they've created a game that, if not for the performance issues, would be an incredibly enjoyable journey into a galaxy far, far away. However, at this point in time, my recommendation is to wait. Either hold off until they manage to fix all the performance issues, which could potentially take a few months, or wait for a deep discount, which, considering the current state of the game and the industry trends, it shouldn't really take too long. Thank you very much for watching, and may the Force be with you.
Hold it. You get 2 lightsabers?
Well, technically 1, but I can split them.
You never gave me 2 lightsabers.
Mark?